we will be talking in the next hour about various issues, and we'll be mainly looking at the role of the civil society in combating corruption, as well as we'll be looking as well at the promoting democracy and security. Just so that you know, we will be taking very much a project-based approach. So we'll be showing you the examples of how civil society is engaged in a fight towards a better world and more corruption-free, equal world. Yes, both of the projects really we'll be talking about. So myself, I'll be talking about Anti-Corruption International, the movement that I'm one of the founding members of. We'll have Jason Woolridge. Yes, very difficult name. I'm sorry, I should have introduced Patricia Galdames first. She will be very much looking at the main, the overarching role of the civil society in general. So both Patricia and Jason, they come from the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies, where they work on a number of civil society and democracy-related projects and beyond. So just to wrap up before we start, we'll be talking about civil society as well as sustainable development goals, different security-related problems, and promotion of democracy. So, do you want to start first, then, or do you want to go directly? Sure. Okay. So first of all, Patricia will give us a little bit of her understanding of the role of the civil society.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you for having us here this afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm here, like Anya mentioned, both myself and Jason, on behalf of the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies. In case, I don't know if any of you know much about the Community of Democracies, we're actually a global coalition of democratic states, and the Permanent Secretariat is actually based here in Warsaw, where it was established 17 years ago by both Poland and the United States. Right now, the community is composed of 30 governing council member countries, including still Poland, the United States as well. Just to touch upon a couple of things, the Community of Democracies has stated its belief in the importance of civil society in all aspects of democratic governance. Civil society is actually an intrinsic and very important part of the Community of Democracies. It's an affiliated body through the civil society pillar, composed of both international NGOs, so INGOs, regional coalitions of civil societies, and in some cases also national level civil societies organizations. Actually, Transparency International is part of its members as well. We do believe that an active, pluralistic, independent, and vibrant civil society is essential to any strong democracy. Civil society is a primary vehicle through which people can organize themselves, convey their interests, raise public concern about any abuses of powers, and exercise their rights, and mainly take part in decision-making processes. In a 2013 report, actually, on the future role of civil society, the World Economic Forum also highlighted the variety of roles that civil society plays in achieving sustainable development, including as a solidarity supporter, meaning promoting fundamental and universal values, as an advocate raising awareness on issues and challenges and advocating for change at the national level. And most importantly, I think, for what we're going to be talking about today, as a watchdog, the role of civil society as a watchdog in holding institutions to account, in promoting transparency and accountability at national, regional, and also global levels. I think by fulfilling these roles, civil society is a key actor, certainly one of the most important stakeholders in contributing to democracy strengthening and development throughout the world. And we have seen this intrinsic relationship between democracy and civil society. The community of democracies has acknowledged this in many of its documents, including and foremost in the Warsaw Declaration, and also in previous declarations that we've had, that we have made at the different ministerial meetings, which happen every 2 years. So Seoul Plan of Action, Santiago Commitment, San Salvador Ministerial, and most recently at the Declaration of Washington that was just made 2 weeks ago. For more information on this, I'm not going to talk about it, but you can actually go to our website and you can look up our documents, as well as many of other things that we've been doing that we'll be talking about here today. Just to touch upon one of the main things that we've been doing for the past 2 years and how we've encouraged and we work together with civil society. We had 3 main priorities of the community of democracies. One was democracy and development, democracy and security, and also civic space, so the promotion of civic space. In democracy and development, actually, we worked together throughout a year-long process, bringing together civil society, academia, governments, in a discussion on how to come up with supplemental indicators for Goal 16. As many of you know, in the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, Goal 16 is actually key in the development, in the achievement of democracy. And even though the word democracy is not mentioned in it, many of its goals throughout the different targets, democracy is mentioned. And certainly in targets 16.5, 16.6, 16.7 are very relevant to the fight against corruption, to the promotion of transparency, to the inclusive participation of everyone. So we worked together throughout a year-long process with several actors, and we came up with supplemental indicators for Goal 16 that are meant to supplement or complement those global indicators that have already been established by the UN. Actually, I have some books that I brought with me. I didn't have enough copies. And you can see some of the supplemental indicators. But again, I suggest that you can also go to our website and you can download it from there as well. Another important thing that we did actually at the beginning of this year, we carried out a study on, again, the enabling environment of civil society as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, trying to understand how civil society is definitely a key actor in anything that the states want to promote, in promoting transparency, in promoting anti-corruption, type of anti-corruption efforts, in trying to strengthen definitely democracy on the ground. And in doing so, we carried out several case studies as well. We looked at certain cases. We looked at a case in Jordan on how civil society engages with government. And in their case, we were looking specifically at participatory budgeting as a tool to bolster transparency and accountability. We looked also at the case of Mexico. Civil society in Mexico has been working together with the government at the national level to actually create indicators for Goal 16 as well. So they've been working hand in hand together in doing this. We looked at the case of Nigeria, where there's town halls that have been established. So again, it's another way of bringing together both civil society and government in this process. So there are some good practices out there that, again, I invite you to look at. This is another study that you can actually see in our website as well. And just to maybe close out my intervention, I'd like to just point out that there are many tools that civil society can engage upon and can use in engaging with the government, including through the Open Government Partnership. I think it's important to mention. Right now in the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, it does call on a very positive engagement between governments and other stakeholders, including civil society. It puts civil society in a key role in doing this in order to accomplish any of the goals. And the other thing, I think that many of the countries, and something to take advantage of, is also the Freedom of Information Act, another important tool for civil society participation in any government decision making. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for very concise and very interesting. I feel that you've touched upon a lot of different important problems and important challenges that are faced throughout the world. Personally, I liked very much this international perspective that you brought into this discussion. And I think it's quite actually also interesting that three of us, we're all from different countries. So maybe we'll get the chance to explore a bit more of international aspect of the civil society later on. So right now we'll have the intervention of Jason Woolrich, who is a planning manager for the Community of Democracies, and he will be talking to you about the project that he's been involved with, the Democracy and Security Dialogue. That is a research project, so welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Anya, and let me start off by saying it's a real pleasure to be here. My involvement with the Schools of Political Studies goes back several years. It's something that's very close to my heart from the beginning of my involvement with the Visegrad School, but also the opportunities I've had to work with the Moscow School of Civic Education and all the many other wonderful schools that the Council of Europe supports. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and believe me when I say you have a true supporter and friend in what you're trying to accomplish today. But I'm going to transition right over into talking about the democracy and security dialogue and what our final report is, the liberal democracy and the path to peace and security. And this is a research project that we've been conducting over the past 2 years with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former Tunisian Prime Minister Mehdi Juma, in which we're trying to look at the intersection between democracy and security and examine the notion that democratic societies are more peaceful societies. And to a lot of us in the room, we might sit and nod our head and say, well, yes, but we wanted to look at the empirical evidence that actually shows quantitatively and qualitatively that this is true, that democratic societies are more peaceful societies. So under the leadership of Ted Picon from the Brookings Institute and Cheryl Frank from the Institute of Security Studies in South Africa, we've conducted a set of workshops and consultations and dialogues with governments, with civil society, with academia, and with the private sector over the past 2 years, in which we went to across several different research lines. We looked at human security, we've looked at gender security, we've looked at cyber security, very importantly, we looked at countering violent extremism, countering terrorism, youth involvement in violent extremism, civil war, violent crime, human rights, all to discover that the findings are very clear, unquestionable, that the more democratic a country is, the more secure a country is. And to say this a different way, the more democratic your country is, the more secure you and your family and your society is. Now, we can look at this in several different ways. We can think about it in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of assembly. The more of this you have, the more secure you are personally. The more access to education that you have, the more inclusive access to education you have, whether regards if you're a man or woman, the more secure your society is. The freer your media is. The greater your privacy is, whether it's online or the privacy at home, the more secure you are, the more secure your society is. And especially when it comes to respect for human rights, and especially respect for human rights in countering violent extremism and countering terrorism. The more we respect human rights along this line, the more secure our societies are. I mean, I can go on, I can talk about 19 different principles. We have 19 principles at the Community Democracy. Our founding document is called the Warsaw Declaration. It was signed in 2000. There are 19 principles that we believe in the organization makes up a truly free and fair democracy. I encourage you all to pick up this little pamphlet and keep it with you if you ever question what those are. I find this to be a really good roadmap for democracy. And ironically enough, if you look on here, we'll find that Russia is one of the signatories of the Warsaw Declaration in 2000. I don't know if this is pre or post you-know-who, but it is an interesting observation, as are a couple of the other countries. So moving on. I'd like to talk about a few of the specific findings of the research. So the evidence does affirm the standard observation that democracies do not go to war with each other. This is very straightforward, and democracies are less likely to experience deadly terrorist attacks, whether they be domestic or international. And the question is why? Why do democracies experience less terrorist attacks? And why do democracies not go to war against each other? And the reason is why there is an opportunity to channel your dissent through nonviolent means and manage violence through respect for the rule of law and human rights. However, on the other hand, some people might ask, well, what about the benevolent dictator? Yes, the dictator who is fair, the dictator who respects rule of rights. I'm a fan of Roman history, so I can only remind you of Claudius. Before Claudius was Caligula, and after Claudius was Nero. Claudius may have been the benevolent dictator, but both before and after him were quite dark periods in which rule of law and extrajudicial killings was day-to-day and standard operating procedures. But on the other hand, if we look at hybrid regimes, what we find is these governments that exhibit both characteristics of a free democracy and characteristics of an autocracy are those countries who are at most risk. And I know that it's quite small and some of you in the back may not be able to see it, but this is what I think the research calls a democracy curve, in which if we look at the scale of democracy along the bottom axis and the level of security, we see that both autocracy and democracies provide a relative amount of security for its citizens. Of course, democracy provides more security for its citizens, but autocracy does as well. There's no doubt. If given a choice, most of us would probably prefer to live under a dictatorship than live in a country such as Syria, in which all rule of law has broken down, in which there is no rule of law, in which human rights has no respect, and in which extrajudicial killings is the day-to-day order. And what we see here is that where we are at most risk are these countries undergoing transition. And this is a horrible selling point, unfortunately, for countries who are here and would like to become this. We do have to be honest and say that there is a risk, there is a security risk that happens here. Now, strong democracies are also less prone to civil war, again for the same reasons. We're able to channel dissent through rule of law. We're able to channel dissent through regulated means, through electoral processes, change of government, and incentives for political participation by a wide range of ideological actors. Imagine you living in a democracy such as Sweden or the Netherlands, and your friend comes to you and says, hey, let's start an armed revolution. Let's start a civil war. There's no incentive for you. The cost of doing so is so high. Because alternatively, you can petition. You can run for office locally or nationally. You can vote for a different party. You have mechanisms to change your government peacefully. There's no incentive to start a civil war. There's no incentive to start armed conflict against your government because of this rule of law. Now, some other findings from our research. Gender equality matters. We cannot stress this more. Inclusive societies in which men and women face the same barriers or lack of barriers are more secure societies. The more women are involved in peace processes, the more women are involved in reconciliating processes, the more secure society is, the more likely that you're going to have a positive outcome of this reconciliation process. Democracies are responsible to public demands. Democracies that respect civil liberties, that respect minority rights, respect rule of law, they are also less likely to experience domestic and international terrorism. Again, we continue to go back to the same thing. I don't need to hammer this on and on, but I do want to touch before I close out on countering violent extremism and countering terrorism. And this is very important. This is something that touches the world globally. It touches us regardless if we are men or women. It touches us whether we're in Poland, potentially in Russia, or anywhere else. We are all potential victims of violent extremism or terrorism. This is a fact, and it's a sad thing. And very often, it's said that why do people join violent extremist groups? And it's very quick to say, it's socioeconomic reasons. It's primarily financial. It's because they come from low-class societies, because they come from poor households. But the research says the opposite. This is not the case. If you go country by country, you find very different motivations. As through the process of the research, they're interviewing and they're asking former militants, former combatants, former members of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Shabab and all the different groups that they could find. What is the motivation for joining? And we found some very interesting things. For example, in countries like Egypt and Nigeria, the primary reason for joining an extremist group is extrajudicial killings by state security services. That means when your state security services are taking a violent hand, an approach to stopping terrorism, they're actually throwing more fuel onto the fire and making the problem worse. However, if we go to Mauritania, what we find is it's actually divorce rates and domestic abuse is the primary motivator for joining an extremist groups. We go to Mali, we look at youth unemployment. We look at Kenya, again, targeting of religious minorities. We see that this is a driving factor for, in the case of Kenya, for even non-Muslims, Christians, religious minorities in Kenya are seen joining extremist groups because of the persecution of the state security services. So, and then in the case of Belgium, where we've had several, horrific attacks, or they have originated from Belgium, we do see that the attackers are coming from middle-class families. Very often in Europe, the foreign soldiers who are leaving Europe and traveling to Syria and to Iraq and joining the Islamic State, they are not from the lowest rungs of society. They are from middle-class families, and very often it is the shame of exclusion of their religion from society that drives them to this. The Islamic State, they claimed they were a state without citizens, and they were calling all loyal Muslims to come and join this state. And they felt, and this call resonated with many Europeans because it was a chance to be included in a society where otherwise they felt exclusion. So it's typically thought the economic drivers are the primary reasons for joining these extremist groups, but as the research has shown, it's not necessarily the case. And the last thing I want to touch on, perhaps, is cybersecurity. And this is a very complicated domain, and the cyber domain can mean a lot of different things. But our research looked at three different things. One, the need to protect our electoral processes. Second, the need to defend human rights online. And the third is pushing an open internet governance while also securing cyberspace. So these are three very important areas that we looked at within the cyber domain. So the question is, what can we do? I've presented quite a few different problems, and the question is now, so what do we do about them? The first, we need to tackle local problems with local solutions. Again, if we go with the mainstream thinking about countering violent extremism, it's all about the money, stupid, right? It's not. We need to tackle these problems with local solutions. We need to tailor solutions specifically to the country in which we're trying to address. And every element of democracy and security, we do need to tailor these solutions locally. I would say that next, women and youth. Women and youth inclusion, they need to have a greater role in society. They need to have a greater role in conflict prevention. They need to have a greater role in countering radicalization and peace negotiations and post-conflict recovery. Inclusion equals security. It's very straightforward. The more inclusive society we have, the more security society we have. And finally, I'd like to say that the international community, the community of democracies, and other organizations, we need to put emphasis on supporting emerging democracies, as I highlighted before. And we go back to this map. Those countries, the places in which you should be afraid of living, are those who are undergoing transition. And this is where the community democracies and other international organizations need to put their emphasis and assisting these in building democratic institutions, building rule of law, and building a strong and free civil society. And I have my 1 minute warning. That was 60 seconds ago. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. That sounds like a very, very, very interesting research project. I personally have about 20 million questions, but I wasn't allowed to ask because we're kind of running short on time. So I guess I'm the last contributor to this discussion, also trying to chair this discussion. So I'm sorry, I'm so not used to sit down and talk. I'm very much of a talker who likes to be involved with the audience. So my name is Ania, I come from Poland. I'm Polish, British. And I'll be talking to you today about the youth involvement in relation to anti-corruption. So I'll be talking to you about two projects. One of them is Anti-Corruption International, and the other one, Youth to Youth Initiative. So, just to tell you, my phone doesn't work, so I have no idea how long I'm talking for, so just tell me once it is. Okay, but somebody needs to tell me because my phone is under the table. All right, sorry about that. So, my story is quite maybe different, maybe normal, but what I'm going to tell you here about is that I'm trying to break the bubble of indifference. So I was living this very comfortable life where I had Monday to Friday job, 9 till 5. I had no travels. And I certainly wasn't taking 150 flights a year like I do now, going around the world talking about democracy and anti-corruption. So why I'm here today is to tell you why I've been inspired and who's inspired me. Because I think it's very important to know that, let me put it this way, if you ask me a very specific question about corruption or democracy, or anything linked to those topics, there is a big likelihood that I might not know the answer. But what certainly, what I would tell you is that you don't need to be an expert to make a difference. So that's the message I'm trying to come across, to put across to you, that you don't need to, because very often when we think about corruption, we think about grand corruption, we think about people on very high level. On very high levels that effectively, they feel too remote to us. So for that reason, I think it's very important to emphasize, at least on my part, that you don't need to. If you think about corruption, you can really start with the small steps within your local community, or on your school level, university level, work level, etc. Whether we like it or not. Because I talk too much, so I'm going to move to the first project I'm going to be telling you about. So this project is Anti-Corruption International. So I happened to be at the festival, student festival, 3 years ago in Norway. And that festival, we had Dalai Lama coming to us, talking to us about the role of democracy. As well as obviously other speakers and other people. But as a group, we felt really inspired that we wanted to make we wanted to make a real change. So we've come up with the idea of setting up our NGO. So that is Anti-Corruption International. That is officially, it is registered in Dublin in Ireland, and it is the biggest youth-led and youth-orientated anti-corruption movement in the world. I don't remember the exact numbers, but we have a couple of thousand members from all over the world, from 130 countries. So what Anti-Corruption International does, it really serves as a platform for different anti-corruption activities. It's been set up by young people who wanted to basically to give themselves and their fellow youth a role in the fight against corruption. So the projects really that Anti-Corruption International is doing are shaped by the members of Anti-Corruption, as well as we work with a number of various partners and collaborators. So very briefly, I'll just talk to you about 5 projects that Anti-Corruption is doing. And as you can see, they're very different in terms of their content and very different in terms of the approaches and methodology as well. So the first project that Anti-Corruption International is doing is Not in My Country campaign. So this is a project that that the methodology of the project is basically based on digital technology and basically we're looking at developing an innovative approach to addressing the role of accountability or lack of thereof, which plays in the fight against corruption and also the abuse of power around the world. So that's a project that's been developed in the United States of America by one of the alumni of Transparency International Summer School back a few years ago that came to us and wanted to work with us on this project. So many of you might have heard of this project. Then Anti-Corruption International is also looking at the whistleblower protection. Basically, the basis of the project is a campaign for improving protection for whistleblowers who basically have a vital role, duty to society. And then what also is very important for me, as I started my talk to you about the importance of breaking this bubble of indifference and getting engaged and being interested in the topics, is the geographical involvement of our members. So basically, we are looking at pretty much most of the countries in the world, but the people that are mostly engaged in the discussion, that are mainly engaged in the topics, those people would be coming from very poor countries, countries where the real rule of law as well as democracy have proved, unfortunately, so far to be a wish rather than reality. So we have a number of countries in Africa that came up with the initiative, members of many countries in Africa that came up with the initiative of creating the Young African Leaders Summit. So that basically was a forum, a platform for people to discuss the role of accountability and transparency in the shaping of the 21st century of an African leader. And lastly, what we're looking at is the cost of corruption. So we are trying to, we know that there is the Corruption Perception Index developed by Transparency International. We're trying to come up with the alternative index, because we believe that the corruption can only be eradicated when its value is well understood. So we're trying to come up with a corruption cost index. And just to tell you the last remark, hopefully it will be the lasting one as well. So for me, corruption, I wasn't involved in corruption activities because it never felt like something that was directly I wasn't involved in anti-corruption work because it felt like it was a remote topic. I didn't feel that I could have a say. I didn't feel I could have a difference. Likewise, I didn't feel that I should care for this problem, and hence I wasn't involved, say, 10 years ago, well, 10 years ago. So for me, it's very important to put something into individual perspective. So that's what I said last year in Berlin, is that corruption costs approximately $1 trillion. That's just a very, very much an estimate. We all know that it's hard to measure corruption. And this is just in the bribery terms as well. So if it's $1 trillion annually, you know how that would multiply the annual gross product of many countries, multiplied by many times. That would buy you about 400 of the newest Ferraris, or you could fill up the Empire State Building with the $1 notes with this amount of money. Right, yes. So with this perspective of corruption that needs to be put into the individual understanding, I would like to finish my intervention, and I believe I can open the floor for the Q's and A's. So all the questions are welcome. Thank you.